The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody. Welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Wednesday, October 16th, Wednesday evening. Second show today, and I'm really looking forward to today's show. We're going to be talking to Greg Salmieri about free speech and with a bunch of, I think, provocative, interesting applications of what free speech means and how to think about how to apply it. They're very relevant to what's going on in our world and has been going on in the world for a long time, but particularly over the last few years with social media. So, hi, Greg.
Hi, great to be here.
Well, thanks.
My favorite podcast.
Sure, thanks for joining me. So, let's first talk about you've written an essay for this new book on free speech. The essay is called "Free Speech is a Right and a Way of Life," and I have linked. I thought I linked. Yes, to a PDF below. Where you guys can download the essay. Highly recommend that you do so. And the essay is part of a book that the Ayn Rand Institute published. It's available on Amazon. The First Amendment Essays on the Imperative of Intellectual Freedom. You can get it as a Kindle or you can get it as a paperback. It was edited by Tara Smith, but it has contributions by Onkar and Greg and Elon Jono. So, it's a great project. So hopefully you guys will go out there and buy the book. I linked to the Amazon page for the book as well on the description below. So tell us a little bit about the impetus for writing this essay.
So let's see. I had given a talk on this back in 2020. It was called something different at the time. But there's an event, Free Speech Week, on campuses across the country, and Texas likes to participate. And we arranged a program where Tara and I were each going to give some talks related to the First Amendment. And some ancestor of this talk was one of them. And at that time, I was very concerned about this idea of people talk about a culture of free speech. So there's the right to free speech, but there's also, even if someone's not violating the right, it's not the government putting you in jail or somebody holding a gun to your head. If you're going to fire somebody, if you're going to cancel somebody, so there's a time of cancel culture. Isn't that a threat to freedom of speech? Isn't there something wrong with cancellation? And, often there is, I think, but not always. And how do we relate this to the idea of free speech, the value of free speech, to what we should be defending? So I wrote a talk about that. At the time, I think it was called Free Speech versus Speaking Freely. And that was the end of it. I always thought I might go back and do something with it. But Tara decided she wanted to put out this book largely of pieces she had written and that were published in law reviews and elsewhere, not all in one place, on different issues to do with the First Amendment. And there was the idea to incorporate some stuff by Onkar, and she asked if I wanted to do this. And so I set to work revising this, 40-minute talk into what I thought would be a short essay. And there was so much going on, Elon Musk, and then October 7th happened, and then there were all these people who said horrible anti-Israel things and signed statements, and people said they wouldn't hire them and so forth, and are their free speech being violated? And all of this kind of, and then the protests, everything kind of broke out, and a lot renewed attention to the issues I was writing about. So I took a lot of time revising and editing, and it became this almost little monograph itself, tacked onto this book. We can get kind of into the issues about it, but I think the main thing that I think it's just really important to distinguish is the right to free speech from the kinds of things that are often called a culture of free speech, but are not. And I think are in some ways anti-free speech. In other ways, they're compatible depending on how you use them. And you really have to differentiate what do you have a right to versus what kind of associations around speech are people willing to engage in, wanting to engage in whatever policies they pick, their ability to pick that, to decide to advertise or not on a certain platform, to decide to have a certain content policy or not have a certain content policy, to decide to hire or fire people who agree with them or disagree with them. All of those policies, right or wrong as policies, are exercises of free speech. And there's not some one right or proper policy for every organization. And there's this kind of collectivist premise coming from John Stuart Mill and others, to the extent that to be for free speech is to not discriminate among your associates on the grounds of what they say, and certainly not for a university or a social media platform to do that. And I think that's a real mistake. And it ends up undermining the idea of the right to free speech. On the other hand, there is something right that we won't be able to keep the right to free speech unless we culturally have a kind of appreciation for free speech, which appreciation is in conflict with this kind of hair trigger, expecting everybody to boycott anybody who says anything that's the least bit out of line. Thinking, if you disagree with J.K. Rowling on trans people or something, now she's should be persona non grata, and everyone should think she should be, even though the things she thinks, where everyone thought them 15 minutes ago. So there's something really wrong and strange about the attitude that's going under the premise of cancel culture, and that's related to problems with free speech, but it's not what people think it is. So what is it? And what is it to embrace free speech as a cultural value if it's not thinking that every place should have policies of neutrality? Because I think very few places should have policies of neutrality. And so I'm trying to spell out what I think is right and wrong about all this.
So let's break this down. I think the way the essay does, the essay really starts with really being clear. And by the way, I highly, highly recommend everybody read this essay. And not only read it, I'd like to see you guys help promote it. I think this is one of those essays that could really have some cultural resonance if we can get it read widely or read by the right people. So tweet it, share it, Facebook it, and get it out there into the culture. It is available without buying the book, although you should buy the book too, but it is available without buying the book. You wanted to say something, Greg?
Yeah, the Institute put it out on New Ideal, and also, I don't think all New Ideal articles are, but this one is on New Ideal Substack, so it could also be restacked or tweeted from Substack. I think Substack is probably a better link to put out than the New Ideal link, because either's fine, but if people start coming to the Substack link, then Substack might start recommending it to other people, so that might be a way to kind of propagate it.
Yeah, this is probably, it's really, really crucial that we do this. This is, this is a really, really important, obviously free speech is one of the most important issues when we think about whether we live in a free society or not. And a lot of people who might have good intentions are getting this completely wrong. So let's start with where you start in the essay, which is, what is the right to free speech as a political right? What is it actually protecting?
It's the right to be secure in your person and your property from attack for saying things. It's the right to be able to speak your mind without fear of being shot, imprisoned, arrested, punched, have things taken away from you. It's just the right to liberty, and the fact that that right can't be infringed upon by what you say. When you say something, you're neither, as Jefferson put it, picking your neighbor's pocket nor breaking his leg. You're not doing anything to him that warrants any kind of reprisal that he would not be entitled to do otherwise. And we think of the right to free speech with very good reason, primarily as a right against the government. The government can't censor you. You can't be arrested, or Congress shall make no law, etc. But I think it's not exactly quite limited to that. Mm-hmm. Congress shall make no law infringing the freedom of speech, but there are other things besides the government that can infringe your freedom of speech if they shoot you, if they arrest you. So ISIS was infringing people's freedom of speech. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who is a government but not our government or England, was infringing Salman Rushdie's freedom of speech when he basically told people to try to kill him. And all the people who did try to kill him and who stabbed him were infringing his freedom of speech. They were threatening his life and limb and property for saying things. And likewise, the people who bombed bookstores and who attacked his publisher and attacked Charlie Hebdo, and everyone who's ever been afraid to speak about Islam, for example, or to draw pictures of Muhammad, not afraid that somebody might tut you, or that someone might dislike you, or even that someone might fight you, but that someone might kill you or behead you. That is your freedom of speech being violated. I mean, we've all done, I mean, you've done certainly way more than I have. And I've done panels on some of these issues to do with the Danish cartoons and things. And, you know, the Institute told me I had to wear a bulletproof vest, right? That is our freedom of speech being infringed upon, that we're in fear of our lives for doing things. And there are people, other examples throughout American history. I talk a lot in the paper about, just because the name of it is so good. Ida Wells had a newspaper called The Free Speech, and she was exposing lynchings and things like that, and people burned it down. And they went and they ransacked it. They threatened they'd kill her. She had to leave. Her partner had to leave. That's what an attack on free speech looks like. And it can be done by the government again, or it can be done by private parties. But it's threatening to kill, maim, injure, steal from you, to violate your other rights on account of your speaking, as though your speaking was a crime, as though your speaking was violating other people, and therefore justified reprisal.
So obviously the government can violate your free speech, and the government, you know, is barred from doing so. But what is the positive action the government must take in protecting your free speech? So, you know, for example, there was you know, everybody denounced Salman Rushdie, not Salman Rushdie, the Ayatollah Khomeini for putting the fatwa out. But what was the positive that need to be done if a government was truly committed to protection of free speech?
Well, they would have needed to really step up to protect him. And I don't know how much was done to protect Rushdie in particular. And let's start with not the Rushdie case, but a case where the person threatening is domestic. There's a domestic conspiracy. Yep. I would need to really aggressively investigate this as a threat, as a conspiracy against somebody's life. There's a criminal gang after somebody, and we're taking that seriously as a law enforcement priority once we realize there's a group of people who are terrified to say certain things because they might be killed. Now, the more complicated condition with Rushdie and the Ayatollah is the Ayatollah was the head of another government. So yeah. I think there you have to view it as, in effect, an act of war against us. And now it's further complicated by the fact that the country that did it had already been at war with us for 10 or 20 years by that time. I forget when Rushdie was, late 80s, early 90s. So, you know, whatever year, since 79 or 8, they were at war against us and we were pretending they weren't. So, you know, we'd already, the horse was already out of the barn door, as they say. But it's to defend people militarily with police, you know, however you can do it against this attack, like you have to defend against the mafia, or to pick another group of terrorists who were anti-free speech, the Ku Klux Klan. And you have to take it really seriously as it's a law enforcement priority to prevent terrorism. Terrorism understood here in the literal sense of people trying to terrorize people out of saying and doing the things that they have every right to say and do.
So what about the governments, which there's plenty of evidence to suggest they did during COVID, going to Twitter and Facebook and other social media companies and saying, look, guys, we don't want you to publish what they call misinformation or false information. And wink, wink, we're requesting this, right? Mm-hmm. How would you think about that in terms of violation of free speech?
I think most requests government makes of private companies are not requests, and they can't really be understood as requests. Yep. And it ought not to be done, and it ought to be illegal to do it, and it ought to be unconstitutional. There were cases that went before the court about this, and it's sort of what the government did here was, I think, probably on the fence of what they do in so many other cases, that it wasn't clear how much of a step beyond the way they're already always violating everybody's freedom of speech it was. So whether this is other than in scale, whether this is an unprecedented kind of thing or not, it's hard to say, and it depends on what the facts are, but it was wrong, and it's wrong when it happens all the time. Now, the thing that makes it a little harder is government officials are, and probably should be, allowed to suggest things, allowed to share information with private companies. If there's a health emergency and the government has experts about it, which they shouldn't, but whatever, they're putting ideas out there. And so the more the government's doing that it shouldn't be doing, but that's not specifically a violation of the company's freedom of speech, the more it's in touch with them about what messaging it wants to get out and so forth. And the grayer or the harder to see the line is. So there's so much that's kind of accepted as background that the government's doing in providing information about diseases in just so many other fields that it's not, it blurs the line. And so when it's crossed, it's less obvious to the courts and less obvious to everyone that, something new has happened here. But yeah, it shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't be happening in the ways it happens all the time. I don't think this case is so different from a lot of others, except that it was more dramatic. There were more eyes on it. And more people are upset about it. And that's good because it's something to be upset about. But I suspect this is happening about tons of stuff in all kinds of ways. And it's not new. I think we actually probably have a lot less of this now than we had in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There are lots of internet media outlets that people are getting information out on, and the government's leaning a bit up on them. But when it was, a handful of newspapers and 3 or TV networks, all of which had licenses that were distributed by the government and needed access to government officials to do their work, I think there was a lot more control over what could be said. So it's got to be taken in context, but it's bad.
Yep. So, a lot of, say, Elon Musk makes a big deal out of he's protecting free speech. And he, by allowing a wide array of commentary on his on Twitter. And he equivocates between whether he's protecting the right to free speech or whether he's equivocating a culture of free speech or what exactly he's talking about when he's talking about free speech. So how do you view this attitude? And of course, he blocks people. I mean, there are people who are not allowed to speak on Twitter. I mean, he has some standard. We know that. We might agree with the standard or disagree with the standard. So how do you take how Elon Musk is trying to position Twitter in the context of free speech?
I don't think it has much to do with actual free speech. And I think it's really sad and it's confusing the issue of free speech, but not in a way. I mean, I don't blame Musk in particular for this. He's taking a line that a lot of people take, influenced by John Stuart Mill. Some people I really admire at Fire and elsewhere, I think, are too influenced by this. But it's a view that there can be such a thing as a free speech platform or a free speech forum, a kind of place, and it's admirable, and there ought to be these kind of places, and it's important for the functioning of society that there be a lot of places like this. And it's a place where basically any kind of speech that isn't prohibited by law and shouldn't be prohibited by law, any kind of speech that's compatible with the First Amendment is welcome. Anybody can come there and say whatever they want, and indeed this platform facilitates platforms, all kinds of speech. I don't think there's a need for there to be platforms like that, and certainly there's not a need for there to be many platforms like that for there to be free speech. It needs to be the case that if you want to say something, it's possible for you to say it. You can find places and people to go to say, but there doesn't need to be some place that's, this particular place is open to everything. But it's widely thought either that is needed for there to be free speech, or that at least there's something better or admirable about there being such platforms. And I think the running together of that idea with free speech is really destructive to actual free speech. All the more so because it's almost impossible to profitably and non-sacrificially live up to that ideal. So if you profess it as your ideal, it's like professing altruism as your ideal. You should live for others and sacrifice and so forth, but you can't do it. So you're going to have to cheat on it to remain alive or remain in business. And then the whole thing is revealed as a kind of hypocrisy. But there is something real, a real principle that you can stand on here, which is defending people's right to say what they want, and then defending your own right to have a platform that has a whatever policy you choose on speech, and respecting all the people who are, involved with, associates in that platform, all the people you're depending on, your customers, your advertisers, or whatever, that here we are all getting together, all exercising our right to speak and our right to associate and our right to associate around speech. And we're owning that we're all doing that. And we're going to come to terms about what kind of environment association around speech we want on this platform. And it's not what we want in the world or what we want everywhere, but like, here I'm on Twitter, and here's how it works for Twitter, and here I'm on Facebook, and here I'm at a university, and here I'm at ARI, and here I'm on the Yaron Brook Show. And in each of these things, we have terms that we come to. And what it would be to really take seriously free speech is to take seriously that fact, to say, we really care about speech, we really care about promoting the kind of environment where we think ideas can flourish. And that's why we're going to have this policy, and we respect that other people will have that policy. And we are owning that we're coming together over an agreement about how to speak, and that is an expression of our rights. And that's what you can't do insofar as you're on the premise that the policy has to be anything goes.
So,
Or ought
so
to be
where does
anything
this,
goes.
so where does this come from? And you mentioned Mill. So what does Mill has to do with this particular issue, and how has his so-called defense of free speech influenced or confused the issue around free speech?
So Mill wrote in On Liberty. Mill has some really beautiful passages about that are often quoted about the need to encounter a diversity of ideas. How if you really want to know something, you have to, hear the other side of it. You have to hear the arguments made against it, and not just made against it from your own teachers who agree with you and are ready to knock them down. You have to actually listen to the people who you regard as bad guys. You have to think about it. And there's something right about what Mill's saying there as a matter of intellectual independence and thinking for yourself. And you need access to these things and so forth. And he's writing in a time when England basically has free speech. At least there are no blasphemy laws and so forth, as there had been previously. And he's very upset about the kind of second-handedness, as we might call it, the conformity of opinion, the idea that ideas aren't changing that much, and people are afraid to speak their minds because they'll be ostracized or fired, or there'll be the social tyranny used against them. Not the government's tyranny, but other people privately will act against them. And so this is the kind of thing he's complaining about. He's in effect writing against cancel culture in his time. And again, there are things right about the spirit of what he's saying, but there's also something very wrong about it. And there's a package deal in this idea of what he calls social tyranny, because some of the things he's talking about under the heading of social tyranny are force. They're unions that break people's bones or whatever if they disagree with them. They're toughs. They're street thugs. It's not the government pressuring you, but it's other people pressuring you with clubs, right? So that's force. That's a violation of free speech. But mostly what it is peer pressure. You won't be fired. You won't be hired. You won't be allowed in polite company, etc. This is the social tyranny he's worried about, and because Mill doesn't believe in rights in the economic realm, he doesn't really believe in rights at all, but he doesn't believe liberty is a kind of moral absolute in the economic realm. He thinks it's, in general, better for people to make choices independently. He's a kind of, utilitarian, general defender of freer markets. But he doesn't see it as an issue of moral principle, whereas he does see free speech as a matter of moral principle. What the argument amounts to is that your ability to say what you want has to be protected from social consequences, as well as from physical consequences, from you're getting fired, from you're getting ostracized, from you're getting shunned. There's something at least morally wrong about that, maybe politically wrong. Maybe the government should step in to stop it, but whether the government should or not, there's something morally wrong with you suffering social consequences for voicing unpopular opinions. But if that's right, that means that there's an obligation on everybody else's part to support you in voicing your opinions. If it's wrong for you to get fired for saying something that I disagree with, then it's I have an obligation to keep on hiring you, to keep on paying you if I'm your boss, no matter what you say. And then what becomes of my right to free speech, right? We've, in effect, the right to free speech becomes what it's long been taken to be by so many quarters, a right to other people's support, financial support, platforms, to say whatever you feel like. And it becomes, therefore, the elimination of the right of whoever it is that is being called upon to provide that support. The owner of the newspaper, the employer, whoever it is, the person who owns the airwaves or who owns a lectern, or the people who run a university or whatever it might be, don't have the people who run Twitter, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, their right to determine what gets said on their property. Some of the people on this who at least realize that it's not a First Amendment issue think, well, they have a legal right, but to set whatever policy they want, Twitter or Facebook or whatever. But there's a moral obligation on them to be content neutral, and there isn't.
Why do you think that's so hard? It seems like a significant issue among people who are grappling with these questions.
Well, there's this idea that intellectual freedom is an easy case. It's something we can all agree upon. All of us who are liberals, in this general sense of liberal, right? So you might be a socialist, you might be a capitalist, you might be a mixed economy person, but whoever you are, if you're a decent intellectual, you're not a fascist. Surely you agree people should have free speech. I mean, it's central to democracy and et cetera. This is the kind of liberal coalition. And this is the kind of thinking that's behind groups like FIRE. So we have to kind of isolate, or free speech gets disconnected from property, from freedom generally, from other rights, and it really can't be and still remain that right. You quickly fall into this view if you try to make that severing, and that's why the idea that you can't separate intellectual freedom from economic freedom was so central to Rand. And this particular issue on free speech was central to her. So if you read the article Man's Rights, quite a bit of it is specifically about the right to free speech, and as a kind of extended example, and specifically about just this kind of issue. People thinking that their free speech was being violated, or someone's free speech was being violated, when a sponsor of a television program would pull his sponsorship if the program said things he didn't like, things like that, that was going on back then, back in the 60s. And it really was going on all the way back to the Hollywood communists and the other communists who were always screaming about blacklists, and their free speech was being violated when people didn't want to, hire them to spread their propaganda in movies.
So, when a platform rejects or blocks somebody, or says we're delisting somebody, or whatever they call it, that's obviously an expression of their free speech, because it's an expression of their standards, their ideas, they want to. Again, that seems to be so difficult for people to actually comprehend. Is it that they view here there's this clash of rights? I mean, I have a right to publish, and he has a right to his standards, and we have to find a way to balance these rights?
Part of it is that. I think part of it is also that nobody's really clear on what their policies are.
Yeah.
And one reason why they're unclear, like if we're thinking about internet platforms and so forth, is this is so new. I mean, there wasn't any platform that was facilitating communication on the scale and at the speed of YouTube or Facebook 20 years ago, 50 years ago. So they didn't, kind of know what they were getting into when they started doing this. Lots of decisions had to be made quickly, and our ability here has somewhat outstripped people's thought about it. And none of these platforms are created really to be platforms primarily for the sharing of ideas on controversial topics and so forth. So when it gets into that, I think the companies are caught somewhat flat-footed. And they're being caught somewhat flat-footed. They're relying on the kind of ideas that are in the culture about speech, about freedom, about what are good policies. And those ideas just weren't very good in the first place. Connected to that is this ideal of free speech being mistaken. This idea of a culture of free speech is a culture in which private companies are sort of neutral arbiters, right? Not neutral arbiters, sorry, neutral platforms. Everybody should be neutral. Encourages people not to think much about this. There's a kind of ideal that seems right to people if they think about it a little bit, and that also seems not to require much of them. oh, we don't have to, we're neutral. We allow everything on our policy, and there's something morally good about that because it's free speech. And then you have that policy and you claim that it's your policy, where the free speech side of the free speech party said the people who were running Twitter, a decade ago, um, until you get to an issue where it stops working. And then that is, you're losing advertisers. Something that you think is really horrific is getting said on your platform. And then you come up with some reason to think that's an exception, but it's all done ad hoc. And you don't rethink the principle because you assume this is a principle of free speech and it's right. So you think we have to moderate on it or something like that. Rather than thinking like, no, the principle of free speech does not tell us and cannot tell us what policy to have for our company. That's going to require us making decisions about who we want to deal with on what terms. It would be like saying the principle of free trade, I'm a free trader, therefore my store should stock everything. And if there are some things I don't stock because I don't think I can make money on them or people won't want them or it's, porn magazines in a children's store or whatever, so that's anti-free speech. That's ridiculous. You can be, sorry, free trade. Free trade doesn't mean I should be buying and selling everything. It means I support the right to do it. And then one of the responsibilities that I have in a world where there is free trade is if I'm going to run a business to figure out, well, what can I make a profit selling? What kind of store do I want here? And this kind of thinking about free speech, mistaken thinking about free speech, I think has arrested people's thought about that issue. There's just not the kind of thinking there needs to be. And so, all this kind of compounds.
So, Musk has created this, bought the platform, the Twitter platform, with the idea that it should be a place where we discuss controversial ideas. So it's kind of set itself up as that, counter to, let's say, Facebook or Instagram or these others. How do you assess, his attempt to create a platform that's interesting and valuable for those discussion of ideas, and how he defends it?
It's not clear to me that he's really been doing that or even trying to do that. There were certain kinds of people, accounts, etc., that it was salient to him were being, de-emphasized, displatformed, shouted. That there were people who he knows and likes or views he's interested in that were maybe being discriminated against or we thought were being discriminated against and by the platform. And seemingly he's taken some steps to on behalf of those views to stop them being put down and maybe to, in general, disempower the content moderation apparatus on Twitter, so that there's less content moderation going on. But that's neither a step for or against free speech. And he hasn't, so far as I can tell, articulated a clearer policy for what the policy is regarding content. And insofar as he has articulated one, it's not clear to me that he's stuck to it. But it's hard to tell what's going on with the platform because we all use it, or I use it, I'm on it. And I tell, what's in my feed, but it's very hard to know how representative that is. If my feed's getting better or worse in some respect, is this, because of what I clicked on last week, or is it because of how the platform's been? So it's very hard to tell. And I haven't seen any good data on it, but it's not, the premise on which he did it wasn't a free speech premise. And though he said it was, or he thinks of it as one. And he wasn't engaged in the kind of thinking about it that would be helping it be more of an issue of free speech. And that's really disappointing to me because some of the ideas that were floated around the time that he purchased it, whether he ever held them or not, but people were speculating on what he might do, I think were the kinds of ideas that would be owning the kind of challenges involved in making a platform like this. Like, for example, you could separate out the underlying infrastructure of what a tweet is and how it is shared and how it's stored, and put that on blockchain or something, or decentralize it in some way that nobody could control. There's no one who can control whether a tweet gets deleted or shared or whatever. Decentralize it, make it more like the original architecture of the internet. Separation, I don't know whether that would have been a good policy or not, but it would have been something that's thinking about the idea that there's a desire to have, and a reason why a lot of people want to have a way to share and exchange information that's not centrally controlled by anybody. But and here I even mean by a company, like you want it decentralized and etc. But also, insofar as you need a corporate body, a company or people want a company to provide the service of providing a feed for you and curating. That company it cannot but have some values involved in the selection process. And so you might think about how can we separate those two functions? And there are other, kinds of questions or decisions that might have been a more kind of owning of the challenges involved in not creating free speech, but organizing people to communicate in a way that supports the sharing of ideas in a context where you know that people are going to be widely different in their ideas and are going to want to avoid giving sanction to ideas they regard as evil.
Yeah, I mean, I think the previous what's the name of the guy who used to own Twitter?
Dorsey?
Yeah, I think Dorsey
owned it.
was
He was the
working on
CEO.
that. Dorsey was working on this blockchain idea around Twitter, and it seems to of a Twitter-like app, but it seems to have completely disappeared. I mean, it seems to have withered away.
Yeah. I mean, and that idea might have been a non-starter, but it was the kind of idea that involves separating the underlying infrastructure from the recommending algorithm and having different standards for them, and you could have different skins or different recommending algorithms on top of the same data structure. It's the kind of thinking that's creative and outside of the box that was there, and reflecting a kind of understanding of what the problems are that I haven't seen in Twitter. It doesn't look like there's been much movement, at least in a positive direction. Some people claim there's been movement in a negative direction. There's more anti-Semitic and other content on Twitter. I can say anecdotally, I report seeing a lot more of it, but whether that's to do with changes in X's algorithm or platform, or just what people are posting, or what people I'm 2 or 3 degrees away from on whatever axis, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Yeah, I mean, Musk has actually sued, I think, some of the advertisers.
Yeah, that is a decidedly anti-free speech move, and that's there are things Musk does sometimes that, well, first of all, if you're going to talk about Musk, particularly now, you can't not talk about this rocket. The thing caught it. It's tremendous. I wish he would, be spending more of his energy on these incredible things that do. I mean, you can't criticize him because however much of his energy he's spending on it, he's spending enough seemingly to make it happen. If and again, I don't know how responsible he is versus other people, but Musk's involved with, at the head of, an organization that's doing tremendous world-changing good things in the space industry. So like that's, I think, it's really unjust to talk about him and not think about that. But I can't view him as a positive or a hero or a champion of anything to do with free speech, because although he occasionally takes good stands for a little while on a particular issue, and again, I was hopeful, not ecstatic, but hopeful when he bought Twitter, he's done things that are horrifically anti-free speech. He's suing advertisers for not advertising with him. They don't think his site is good. They don't think his site is good for their brand. And his view is, oh, but I'm making a gift to humanity with this site, with this algorithm done this way. And you, Coca-Cola or Disney or whoever it is, doesn't matter if it helps or hurts your bottom line or what your judgment is about it. You have to be conscripted into my, quote, free speech defense plan. That is really unjust. It's a real violation of rights. And it's a horror to author a lawsuit like that. So, if he's good in standing up temporarily to Brazil, or some other unjust government mandate, it's good for him, but it's no better than anyone else who is, vocal when their rights are being trampled on, but is ready to try to trample on the rights of somebody else the next day. It's not a defense of free speech. It's just an assertiveness in the face of things that are harming you, which is, good so far as it goes. But it's not heroic, and particularly not when you are yourself a perpetrator and condoner of the real rights violation, the real injustice.
So, what's your assessment of kind of the status of free speech in America today? You know, we've got a Supreme Court that in some ways is fairly good, in some ways is pretty bad. How do you assess their approach to free speech, but more broadly in the culture and in politics? Where does it stand?
I think the court, now I'm not talking about the court over the last few years where we have three justices appointed by Trump who are good in some ways and bad in others, and each one of them is different. But I'm talking about not the court now as opposed to 5 years ago, but now as opposed to 50 years ago.
Mhm.
The court has evolved in a good direction on speech. It's one of the rights they're taking more seriously. They're trying to protect it. Certainly more than 100 years ago. This is an area where over the course of America's history, the court has gotten more aggressive in policing attacks on free speech, and they have struck down types of attacks on it from the left as well as the right, both sides. So, and often decisions that are unpopular, like Citizens United, which is seen as a kind of right-wing decision, I think is really the right decision on free speech. Attacks on, reining in not enough, but somewhat campaign finance law. I'd like to see them rein it in more. But they've been more aggressive, more activist in a good way on free speech than courts in the 19th and early 20th century were. So in that respect, good for the court. I don't see the more recent changes. There were some more conservatives and fewer liberals and so forth on the court. I don't see them as making a big difference on this issue. I think the more left and the more right appointees are both better than people were 100 years ago at this level in government on these issues. And that there are some people from both sides is good because it they'll be more sensitive to attacks coming from one quarter or another. Right now, I think in general, the court has, I think, widening from the issue of speech, the court works better where it's more close between the conservatives and the liberals, or the Democrat appointees and the Republican appointees. Both parties have real problems in the kind of people they put on the court.
Mhm.
The problems are somewhat complementary or opposite to each other, so that where you have a closer court, it tends to be better. I think I would in general prefer a court that was sort of slightly more Republican appointees than Democrats, but not way more. And now we've moved over to the, way more position. But, it's a fairly good court. And I think that for this issue of speech, and I think that's one of the high points in speech. The other high point is the nature of technology. The nature of the internet means that there's just a lot more places to speak and a lot more facilitation of speech, and it's harder to regulate it if people want to than it ever has been before. And the impression that we're now in some dark ages for free speech where, you can hardly say anything is created by the fact that we have more speech than we ever did before. So people, I find this opinion like particularly foolish. This idea that, well, back when Walter Cronkite was on the air, the news was neutral and you could say whatever you want. People think that because when Walter Cronkite was on the air, they never heard any opinion that wasn't within a very narrow band, as they weren't aware that there were lots of opinions that were being suppressed or, hardly got out there. Now you hear all kinds of opinions and you can think of, boy, you don't hear more of that. CNN wouldn't have shared that story, whether they should have or not. If you're hearing the story, the battle is is already part one. So, in fact, I think we're more able to say more things than we have been before. And the courts protect it better than they have, at least in many periods in the past. On the other hand, our politicians, now as opposed to in the recent past, are much more aggressively in their rhetoric anti-free speech. So you have Kamala Harris talking about not running away from some of the stuff the Biden administration did over misinformation, but giving speeches about, you can't have misinformation and that's not free speech and so forth. And ominous sounding speeches that make you think, well, I could never vote for this lady. She's awful on free speech. And then her opponent comes on and says he wants to pull CBS's license because they, spliced the tape in an interview with Kamala Harris. I mean, these are not friendly to free speech candidates. And they're in particular both engaged in what is anti-freedom rhetoric around speech, even when they sometimes say they're for free speech. I mean, Kamala is all about, we are pro-freedom now. Suddenly the Democrats have found the word freedom, because there's, on one issue, they are significantly more for freedom abortion, but the others not. And the Republicans now claim to be for free speech, but supporting a guy who has been threatening news agencies that don't cover him well with legal reprisal for quite a long time. And he was doing this during his presidency, Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So at that level of political culture, it's gotten a lot worse and a lot worse in a short time. I think there's enough inertia in the legal system to protect us from that for a period. There won't be for 20 years or 30 years, but I'm not worried about if either of the candidates tried to do anything horrible on this when they got elected. I think it would be, stopped in the courts, and I think that's good. So I think we have time, but it's scary.
Yep. One other issue I want to address, and that's this, which is relevant since October 7th. It's the issue of protests. We've got these protests on campuses everywhere. We've also got almost every weekend now in New York. It seems like the streets are blocked, and there's this notion in America that people have a right to protest. It's part of right to free speech is the right to go out and block streets in the name of speech. So is that consistent?
No, Ankar Ghate gave a really, the first time I heard him talk about this was on your show around the time of the Charlottesville, whatever you want to call them, demonstrations back in whatever that was, early in Trump's presidency. And he was making the point that there just isn't a right to do this kind of thing. And it's a point that Rand had made, and that we need to understand that these kind of protests are not rightful, to have the background context to think about all the other issues that come up in them. And I invited him to give a talk after I was down here at Texas on this. It was called something like Questioning the Sacred, about the right to protest. And it was a good talk. I was hoping a version of it would be in the book that we're promoting, the First Amendment book. He planned to edit it, but that didn't quite get done in time. Hopefully it'll be in a future edition. But I do talk a bit about it in my piece. You could find Ankar's talk online, and there's some discussion of it also in the book in an appendix where Tara, Ankar, Ilan, Jorno, and I are all talking about these issues. But no, the right to free speech means you have a right to speak on your own property, to people who are willing to listen to you. You don't have a right to go on other people's property, like private property, like the Occupy Wall Street people did. They commandeered someone's park, and it was private property, and they, took it over. They were banging drums, making noise, making it impossible for people to do business and go about their days. This is not rightful. This is a violation of the rights of the people around them, and it doesn't make it right that they have something to say, even if the thing they had to say was interesting or true or important. It doesn't give them the right to do that any more than that Palestinian student who tried to take over her law school professor's house and give a speech had a right to his house because she had a speech to make. That doesn't give you a right. Now, when it's public property, which there shouldn't be, but public streets, a public park, etc., that somewhat complicates the issue, because it's not someone's particular property you're seizing, and there shouldn't be public property. And one of the reasons that there shouldn't be public property is it raises the question of who should get to do what on it. And there's no objective way to decide who should get to do what on it, because there's no legitimate rationale for the property existing. But insofar as we do have things that are public property, streets, roads, etc., parks, they each have alleged purposes that they're being supported by tax dollars for. In the case of roads, it's clear to get from one place to another, and nobody then has the right to take over a road and stop people from getting from one place to the other just to express their ideas. Parks, it's a little more debatable, but I think the basic idea still holds. It's for recreation. Now, once the government starts allowing people to use these places as forums, you can get a permit to, give a speech in a park, or anybody is allowed to say whatever they want, as it happens in the public areas, non-classroom areas, open spaces on the University of Texas's campus. This is a decision Texas's government has made, so anybody can stand out there and say whatever thing they want. Once it starts allowing these things to be used as pulpits, basically, then I think it's a application of the principle of free speech, that an application of the First Amendment, that it has to be content neutral in the policies it allows. But that's not because anybody has a right to this property. It's already a violation of free speech, that my tax dollars are being used to support a space where anybody can come and say whatever the hell they want, including things I might find abhorrent, and I can't stop them, even though it's my money that's being taken to do it, right? And likewise for every other person in Texas and who's being taxed to support this. It's already a violation of free speech. It's just that that violation is compounded when a particular ideology is overlaid over it. So if the view is a majority view, then people can say it, but if it's a minority, they can't, or vice versa. So it's important to, if you have this violation of rights, which is involved in letting public property be used this way, that you then don't compound it with a double standard. And that's what gives some sense to the idea that they have a right to do this, but they don't.
Yep. So actually, one other question. Academic freedom, a term that's, I think, again, one of these terms that is misused quite extensively out there. Can you tell us what you think about academic freedom and its connection to free speech?
Yeah, I don't think it's a valid concept. It's the idea that academics should be able to promote whatever views they like, and face no professional consequences for it. They shouldn't be able to be fired. They shouldn't be able for expressing their views. Now, if what they're, and particularly when they're doing it outside of class, if they're spending their class time teaching things that's unrelated to the class, obviously they're not doing their jobs, and etc. But nobody could fire me from teaching at Texas because they saw me on the Yaron Brook Show and I said something they think is awful or whatever. That's the idea of academic freedom. Of course, I don't have tenure, so there'd be no way to prove if anyone was trying to do that. But anyway, that's the idea. I don't think it's valid. It's certainly not a freedom that anybody has a right to. If anything, it might be something that you contract for, right? Like, so my contract with Texas, the university, maybe says that they can't fire me for these kinds of things. Now, it's a public university, so I think here we're in the same situation as with public parks, and I'll get down to that. But suppose it was a private university I was working for. It could only be a kind of contractual right. And then the question is the same question as we have with something like Twitter. Is it the right or a good policy for a university to say that its professors can say whatever they want and they won't get fired for them, to have these kind of contracts with them? And I think there are pluses and minuses to it. Or put it more generally, I think professors, people who are exploring new ideas, people who might want to have, challenging, controversial ideas, people who are looking for the truth and know that they have to follow the ideas wherever they lead to, have good reason to value having a lot of latitude in what they say, and not to have to be worried about what's going to get them in trouble with the administration and etc. So it's reasonable that when professors are negotiating for their contracts and what they want in it, a lot of latitude and a lot of protections, that they can't be sort of capriciously or too easily fired if their views get out of line with the administration. That's something professors should want, or at least it makes sense. It's in their interest. But that doesn't mean that it overall makes sense for and then universities who want to attract good professors, there's a reason to want that. Also, universities who want to have an environment where, for the kinds of reasons Mill was so eloquent about, they want to have a lot of different ideas being discussed there and being debated vigorously. They have a reason to want to have people who disagree with one another and who might sometimes say things that are very unpopular. And so creating these kinds of policies that allow for a lot of speech with little consequences, there's a reason to want to kind of push in that direction. But it can't be and shouldn't be treated as a right or as a kind of absolute. And there are going to be, it always comes up against limits. There are things you can say that make people not want to associate with you. Be afraid that you're not going to be able to grade them fairly because you've said things that are so prejudicial or seem to them to be prejudicial against the kind of person you are or against your views. This is going to happen. And one of the things that schools are doing are creating an environment for people to go and learn in. And they're competing for students, they're competing for faculty, and they're competing for these things on all sorts of factors. And part of what they have to think about is like, what kind of a community do I want to develop, and what ideas, what views, what practices are in bounds and out of bounds, and to think of it as an issue of rights rather than as, what goes on in developing a community and maintaining a community and a corporate culture in a university, I think just misses the point of the thing. And it makes it kind of litigious and argued about on the wrong kinds of grounds. Incidentally, the history of this is really interesting. I don't know if you how much people know about it, but the whole academic freedom movement got started in America. It's connected to the formation of the tenure system. And it got started when Jane Stanford, the woman who was, basically founded or co-founded Stanford University with money that her husband made. He was by this time dead, or by the time of this story dead, in the railroad industry. There was a faculty member at Stanford who was a sociologist and virulently racist, anti-immigrant, and anti-business. And he had said some really incendiary things about, I think it was at the time, Japanese or Chinese workers coming to the country, the very kind of workers her husband had hired, to work on his railroad. And he had said something like, we should fire on these boats. It was quite, dramatic. And she was also concerned that he might be a communist, and so forth. And she wanted his contract not to be renewed. And a lot of people got up in arms over this. He was eventually fired, but it was seen by many as a black mark on Stanford. And some of the other professors from Stanford, and James Dewey, another, general historical villain, founded the Association of American University Professors, which started advocating for academic freedom. And their grounds for doing it are basically professors shouldn't be influenced by the government or by economic considerations, like due to the people paying the tuition.
Yep. Or the owners.
Yeah.
Property. Yeah. It's yeah. So they were anti-property rights even back then.
Yeah, and it's a strange view that we have to insulate people from financial consequences. I think a lot of academics think that there's something wrong with having a job or working for someone where maybe they wouldn't pay you if they disagreed with your ideas. And if you are that way, then you can't really be a free or independent thinker. And that just strikes me as a really cowardly way to think about a profession and work. As though, imagine you're an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs are people who think really deeply and independently about what kind of things should be built. And you wouldn't be an entrepreneur if you didn't disagree with a lot of people about, like, I think we should have, personal computers and no one else does, and everybody thinks I'm crazy and no one wants to hire me to do this. But you find, this is, like, I think the paradigm of intellectual freedom and action and work. But part of the job is you find the people who agree with you, who are willing to put money on it. That's part of your job as an intellectual. And not to expect, I can say whatever I want without thinking about whose paycheck I'm taking, and that somehow is shows that I have integrity, that I don't care where my money is coming from. So again, I think there are reasons to not want to have too narrow I'm employed to say these things and I'm a spokesperson for this, but to think that you have to there's no limits on what you can say that's compatible with this job is somehow a prerequisite for intellectual integrity or promotes intellectual integrity. I I think is crazy. And it's a kind of Robert Stadler premise for people who have read Atlas Shrugged. You want to be able to disassociate the life of the mind from production, from the source of
Mhm.
the funds that are paying for it. And in effect, you demand that other people sacrifice for to give you a platform.
And then they look down on people who actually are the producers.
Yeah,
Because it's a form of the mind body dichotomy. I mean, it's the mind is what matters. That's grubby stuff that they do over there. We shouldn't be beholden to them.
exactly. And this whole way of thinking about free speech that tries to separate it out from economy, associations, other things is the mind-body dichotomy. It's a
Mhm.
kind of anti-business, anti-money-making mentality. And it's sad that so many businessmen and industrialists, think Elon Musk here, have
Right.
come to endorse it and help to give it a new lease on life.
Yeah. All right, great. So we have a bunch of questions. Let's go to those. So you guys can ask Greg um, any questions about anything, I assume.
Yeah.
He's not committed to answering all your questions, but you can ask. And let's if you want to dig deeper into free speech, that's great. If you want to cover other topics, that's great as well. This is also a form of raising money for the show. So consider that as well. I know a bunch of you have done, some of you already have done some stickers. Thank you, John. And thank you, Mary Aline. And I saw Jonathan Honing there somewhere. So thank you to all, and Carolina from Mexico. Thank you all for the stickers. Really, really appreciate that. And let's jump in with some of the questions. Lucinda writes, um, Greg is probably my favorite living objectivist philosopher. The Fountainhead on What is Important and What is Not by Greg helped me get through a tough time in my life, and I still rewatch it sometimes when I need motivation. So,
Oh, thanks, Lucinda. You're one of my favorite Yaron Brook Show super chatters. You've asked a lot of good questions.
she
I've
does.
noticed over the
Wait,
months.
Lucinda, you were going to ask Greg the question that you weren't satisfied with my answer to. Let me see if she has. So I'll ask you, Greg, completely unrelated to free speech, but Lucinda asked me this question a day or two ago. I don't know if you heard the show, but it was the one about punishments. So
Yeah, about justice.
should jail time, should the purpose of jail time be to punish? Or if somebody can somehow convince you that they're completely they will never do this again. Should they not be punished and just let free? So what is the
Um,
basis
I think
of
punishment is an essential part of what it's for. I don't know what it would mean for somebody to be able to convince you of that. Like if a part of what would convince me is that they were willing to accept the punishment, at least for, if the punishment was just in the first place. I thought your answer was good. I remember listening to the show. The one thing I would add to it, though, is a recommendation. So, Leonard Peikoff, in his course Objectivism Through Induction, one of the inductions he gives to introduce the principle is the principle of justice. And as I recall, he talks about justice and punishment, and is it about retribution or rehabilitation and so forth in those lectures. And I don't remember everything he says, but I remember finding them very clarifying. So I think that I know that lecture series is available online in some form or other. I don't know if it's through a paywall or free, but there's a lecture series, Objectivism Through Induction. It's, I think, one of the really, I mean, many fantastic lecture series Leonard Peikoff gave, but one that was particularly influential on me. And you can listen to the whole thing and learn a lot about methodology, but you could also just pick a lecture on a given topic and you learn a lot about that topic. And the one on justice deals with some of these issues.
That's right. Yep. So Lucinda, it is available free some way, maybe on the ARU app or maybe just on YouTube. I'm sure you can find it. All right. Kirill asks, a concept's caused. Are the antecedent concepts and concretes part of their causal hierarchy?
A
Is it
con
proper? What's that?
say that again. I didn't quite follow the grammar of that.
Yeah. So a concept caused,
Uh,
semicolon. Are antecedent concepts and concretes part of the causal hierarchy?
Well, I would say, yeah, concepts are caused. They're caused by people. We form the concepts. So the primary thing that is the cause is us. And then the way in which we cause them involves making use of the antecedent concepts and ultimately the observation. So in the same way as a building is caused, you wouldn't say a building is caused and part of the cause is the bricks. I mean, in a way that's true, but the cause of a building is the builder. And then the builder uses bricks and timber and whatever things he's using to build the building. And they're, of course, part of the cause then too, but part of the cause as his instruments, his tools, his materials. And I think likewise, concepts and in general knowledge is caused. And it's caused by the knower and by the work of the knower, the activity that the knower is doing in knowing. And that activity makes use of often prior knowledge. And so that prior knowledge is part of the cause of the subsequent knowledge, but it's part of the cause again in the way that ingredients are part of the cause of a recipe, or building materials part of the cause of the building. The primary cause is the builder, and these are the tools and materials he makes use of.
So he goes on and says, is it proper to treat concepts as abstract entities in the same way we treat equal subdivisions of a length as countable entities?
You can I don't really know what that means. I'm happy to call concepts abstract entities. Rand calls them that in one place, or mental entities anyway. But when you say in the same way, I want to know, like, what are you doing with it? You can't count them in the way you would units of length, so that they're entities in the sense that they're stable, enduring units in the mind that you can take as the units of your knowledge, and that's the sense in which they're entity-like. They function as subjects of knowledge, and that's the sense in which they're mental entities. I'm not sure the equal subdivisions of a rope when you're measuring it are, I think, much more transient than a concept is. A concept is much more entity-like in a more robust sense than that is. So the analogy, it's unclear to me what use you're making of this analogy.
All right, thanks, Kirill. Ali says, I think we need a guitar segment.
We tried that once and it didn't come over.
Work. No, something about the mic didn't really pick it up.
Yeah.
I don't know. All right, well, we'll have to, one of these days we'll try it again. Let's see. Shali says, how do you view the issue of free speech in Europe, especially in the UK, where the government goes out of its way to infringe upon free speech? It seems Brits are set on censoring themselves back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I don't follow European and English news as much as I do American. And I've seen a lot of things that are concerning there. But you see them, I see them from the people who are complaining about them. And to really know what objectively is happening, you have to look into it a little bit more than I have. So I don't feel like I have a good handle on what's going on in Europe as opposed to America. Certainly this business of penalizing people legally for Facebook memes and things, or social media memes, is very troubling and concerning. And topics of it have come up that are crazy. I mean, the one that's most obviously, years ago, I forget when it was, some guy, trained his cat to heil or something like that, and then he got arrested for it. And that's the joke was in poor taste, perhaps, but that is egregious and absurd, and I don't know ultimately what happened to him. So this is not brand new. This was, I don't know, 10 years ago maybe that this happened. Maybe it was less time than that, but it's not the kind of things we've been hearing about in the last year or two. And so Europe's been, and England's been in a bad course with this for quite some time. Other things that are really concerning in England is the law about misgendering people, the thing that J.K. Rowling is so upset about, and you could see her being more incendiary in many of the comments she's making about trans people. I think purposely trying to get herself targeted by this so she could be a test case. And I think that's proper and brave of her. Again, whether or not one agrees with the particular thing she's saying, to say it in a less sensitive and more inflammatory way to combat this law, which I think is manifestly unjust, I think is courageous and proper. The thing that makes it a little more complicated in some of these cases, the most recent ones having to do with there were riots and things in the streets, and then people were targeted for some Facebook or some social media memes. On the face of it, that seems really wrong. And I think it is really wrong. But the thing one has to think about when one's trying to understand this is, if it's true that the government has a responsibility, as I was saying, to protect people from threats on the grounds of their opinions, right? And in general, to protect people from physical threats. You have to think about the kind of speech that was involved in, or the kinds of actions that are involved in getting people to commit acts of jihad, for example. You're promulgating it around that this guy's an infidel and he deserves to be killed, and so forth, and you're saying where he lives and what his address is, and you're riling people up, and at some point it's inciting to violence. And at some point, participating in certain forums and schemes and so forth are inciting to violence. And in particular, in the case of jihadis and so forth, I think if anything, authorities have been too lax and have let these kinds of murder cults proliferate, haven't investigated them thoroughly enough, and so forth. If they had, and they had really treated it like a criminal organization and taken the kinds of things that the government can do under the laws, American government now can do under the laws that were used to attack the Klan and so forth, there'd be really aggressive persecution of this, and so a prosecution of this. So if I'm saying on the one hand we need to protect people and so forth, the government needs, as part of protecting free speech, to be able to go against these kinds of things. Then part of what I'm saying in saying that is it has to be able to, when groups are coming together to get involved in what might be potentially violent action and gin one another up and so forth, the government has to take an interest in that. And as soon as the government does take an interest in that, and take an interest in what kind of communications are going on between people and so forth, there are going to be cries that they're persecuting people, shutting down their free speech, etc. And I want to know exactly what they're doing and why they're doing it before I know about a particular case. Is there anything to those claims? I think probably there is. I think probably they're not doing what they should and doing what they shouldn't. But in the case of things that are being shared around the time that there are violent, things out in the streets, you want to know what are they doing, what are they trying to do, why are they doing it, and how are the people that are the kind of charismatic victims of what the government's doing getting caught up in it, and are they really victims? Again, I suspect they are, but I haven't dug into the case, and I think you need to.
Let's see. Richard says, what do you think about when one should use artificial intelligence versus thinking for oneself? For example, a student shouldn't have AI do their homework, but AI can help with research in other cases.
Yeah, I mean, you have to think about, I don't know what to say about do their homework, because it depends on what the homework is. That is, if you've decided to take a class because you want to learn what you're going to learn in the class, and even put aside the school's honor code, which you should follow if you've committed yourself to following it. You want to do the homework because that's part of learning what you're trying to learn, and there's things been assigned to test your ability to do them, to help you develop the skill. So that example doesn't strike me as that useful, because the question is, well, why this homework? What homework is something you shouldn't use a computer to do for you, precisely because it's supposed to be something you need to do for yourself to develop a skill. But then the question we want to ask is, what kind of things do you need to do for yourself to develop a skill, or for whatever purpose? What would make this a good homework assignment or not? And there, I think we need to think about really, what can AI help us do? What's it good at? What's it useful for? And if it turns out that something we used to need to learn to do for ourselves can be done really well by AI, and we don't need to do it anymore because we could just outsource it to AI, maybe we should stop having homework in that thing. It's no So we'll learn as we learn what the tool is good for, how to use it. I could say some of the things I use it for, and I've tried to use it for. Uh,
Sure.
I think it's not really good exactly at doing research, but it's good at summarizing things. It's good if you're looking for examples of things. It's good if you put a text into it of making it such that you can kind of converse with that text and interrogate it, ask it questions about what's in it. One of the things, this probably won't be useful for too many people, but you can abstract one level for the example. The thing I found it most useful for actually is in connection with translating Greek.
Hmm.
All of the old 19th century reference works, which everyone still relies on, are up on the internet, so we can get them. And therefore, if you ask it to act as a professor of philology, and you don't have it translate a whole thing for you, which it won't do that well. It's not terrible, but you're going through it and you're like, well, why, what's the meaning of the dative particle in this sentence? And why do some translators translate this word this way? I would have thought it's that way. It could actually give you answers and you can talk to it and it really helps working on translation. So now whenever I'm doing something in Greek, I have ChatGPT open and I'm chatting with it. So these are kind of things it does. And I'm sure there are that's concretely the thing I found it most useful for. Um, but just experiment with ways to get it into your workflows and see what works.
All right. Thank you, Richard. Tassos, thank you for the sticker. Gail, thank you. Really appreciate it. Tassos says $50. Thank you. 10th super chat on a live stream. Let's see, Andrew, what is the essence of objectivism's view of causality in contrast with other philosophies? And what is the significance of objectivism's view?
The essence of objectivism view of causality in contrast to other philosophies. The essence is causality is the law of identity applied to action, that we're understanding it as the to understand causes is to understand that things have natures, which means that they act in particular ways. Everything has a repertoire of actions that it can do, and it can do those actions and not other actions. And in most cases, there's only one kind of action it can do in each situation. In the cases of things that have choice, the one thing they could do is choose, and so there's then a range of actions they could choose in the situation. But you understand causality as entities and what they do in situations, as opposed to what? As opposed to thinking of causality as a kind of series of if-then statements among events or states of affairs. So this happens and then that happens. When in such and such happens, such and such happens. So lots of if-then statements. The way philosophers since Hume in general and especially these days tend to think about causality, it's all in terms of regularities or regularities plus counterfactuals if you've taken philosophy classes on this, but it's all if this, then that. At time one, this, then at time two, that, and etc. And the idea of entities and what they can do and their nature is sort of read out of the story. But I think that is the causality, the idea of entities with their natures. Probably the best thing to read on this, I wish there was more written, but there hasn't been much, is Jason Ryan's essay on metaphysics in a companion to Ayn Rand, the book Ellen Godhoff and I edited for Blackwell. Jason Ryan has a chapter on metaphysics, and there's a substantial discussion of causality in there, including ways in which the objectivist view is in the Aristotelian tradition, how it's similar and different to other views, and that's the place to start.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Lucinda says, I've actually been listening to Objectivism through induction, and I'm currently working and thinking through the third lecture, which means the next one will be the one on justice. Excited to get to it. Thanks for the advice, Greg.
Good for her. So I don't
She
know
has
if we
gone through so much of the objectivist literature, and she's super young. I mean,
Yeah, this is so I
really
don't know
amazing.
much about you, Lucinda, just what I've gathered from hearing this.
Yeah.
But you seem to be a philosophy student, maybe in Europe, and young, but doing kind of graduate-ish with graduate kind of interests. So I don't know if you want to reach out to me, get in touch. I'd be interested to learn a bit more about you and what you're doing.
Take him up on it, Lucinda. All right, she continues. When I was 13, I got investigated by German police for hate speech because of some jokes I made that were admittedly in poor taste.
This is
Caused
the sin. This
horrible
is
anxiety issues because German law was very unclear about what I could expect.
huh. Is this Lucinda or someone else who's saying this now?
This is Lucinda. Yeah.
Um, I mean, German law, I know has laws against hate speech. Those are inherently non-objective. I know Holocaust denial laws. So it's not a surprise that one doesn't know what to do when dealing with the German legal system here.
Hmm.
I'm sorry that that happened to you.
Yeah. She continues. Since I've started taking classes on ancient Greek, I've been thinking about what ancient languages could teach us about the conceptual development of ancient cultures. Any advice on how I could explore that train of thought?
Oh, well, this goes to my earlier advice. So this is something that GPT is actually really useful on. So it's good on word roots. It's good on of these Greek words, which one's prior to another etymologically, what's the first attestation we have. But you can get this kind of information in by doing searches of the TLG, Thesaurus Lingua Graeca, if you know about that resource, listen to. But it's useful to have something you can just chat with about it. And it's not infallible. It gets things wrong sometimes, but it's a good start and you can look things up. So I think this is a good thing to kind of actually use AI to help you think about the history of. You can overdo thinking you can read too much off the etymologies. But I find it helpful, particularly so many of our words come from Greek and Latin, and the way in which words come from Greek and Latin typically has to do with the development of science and logic. It's not just they casually passed into language, but when people are trying to make a study of something for the first time, they found a need for these terms. And I think, yeah, you can learn a lot that helps your thinking in terms of that.
Yeah, I
Another
was gonna point out that she was talking about conceptual development of the culture itself. So can you take from the language to the culture?
I worry about what's called Worfianism, where people try to think they could understand more about a culture than you really can by differences in this language. You know, such and such culture has this many words for snow, and that tells you something. And most of those things turn out to be untrue. So it's easy to think you can learn more than you can. But let me give you two uh, different recommendations on language. Um, One is sort of a little more fanciful. So there's a book that is beautifully written, has some true stuff in it and a lot of fun stuff in its perspective is really beautiful in a way and very much in line, Lucinda, with how you're thinking. And that's a book called A History in English Words by a guy named Barfield. I think Barfield. He was part of this group of people who called themselves the Inklings, around which J.R.R. Tolkien and Lewis, who were all friends at the time. But he was the only one who wasn't a Catholic. He didn't become a Catholic. He instead became some kind of crazy Hegelian, so not much better. But anyway, he was this author who wrote this book about words, and he goes through the English language and talks about the roots. And this root comes from Indo-European, and this root comes from that. And he tries to tell you the whole history of culture as you could see it in the words in English. So a history in English words. He's going, now the book was written like in the 30s or something, so we know a lot more about the development of language now, and I'm sure some of the findings are out of date and some of it's a little fanciful, but the spirit of interest in language, interest in learning is really fantastic. There are some true things, and then the perspective, the caring about language, and the caring about how it's connected to knowledge, I think is really beautifully conveyed. There are a lot of good examples of it in the book, and I think if you're interested in this kind of thing, you'll really enjoy the book, as I did. So that's a book that's very much on the line of how you're thinking, and I think you'll enjoy. Um, as a corrective, maybe, to the things that are maybe not quite accurate linguistically about it, and just as a really good resource on language in general, John McWhorter's stuff on linguistics is fantastic, and I particularly like he has a course that's available over Audible called something like The Story of Language or The History of Language. That he's got a lot of books and courses on these kind of things, but that one I think is particularly good. It's 30 some odd lectures, and he just talks about the whole development of language. And it's really interesting, I think, from He's not interested in epistemology or talking about it from that perspective, but I think what he says about how grammatical features and structures form is really valuable for thinking about certain issues in epistemology. And also, he's good as a corrective to the possible Worfianism that people pray to, the idea that you can sort of read too much off of a culture about from the details of its language. And he's good about maybe overstresses, but is good for sensitizing you to the amount of kind of randomness that's in the details of how a language develops.
She asked how she should reach out to you. The link on your email and ARI doesn't seem to be working.
I don't have an ARI email, I don't think. If I say my email, who knows who's going to write me, but it's easy to find online anyway. It's gsalmieri at either gmail.com or utexas.edu. Both of them reach me.
Yep. And if you didn't get that, just write to me and I'll forward you the email. All right. Thanks, Lucinda. All right. Let's go. Michael asks, is labeling what Israel is doing as genocide the most vicious form of nihilism?
It's false. I think it's a kind of pretense. And I think it is nihilistic, whether it's
The most.
more vicious than thinking America's evil and a force for evil in the world, or then running buildings into the World Trade Center on 9/11. There are a lot of really vicious forms of nihilism, and it's of a piece with many of them, but I don't know. I would give it the absolute prize. But the whole concept of genocide as it's being used now, and certainly the concept of settler colonialism and colonizing, these are all anti-concepts as they're used now. There is a valid concept of genocide, but it's much narrower than how it's used now. And I think most of these other concepts that are part of this narrative are just invalid concepts. And anti-concepts in particular, they're things that are designed to obscure and destroy clear thinking.
Yeah. Michael also says, Greg, can you organize another pro-Israel talk in Austin?
Well, who's going to give it? Yaron, you want to come? I'm happy to host them when there's something to say and someone to say it, and we have an idea for what to do. Yaron, you and I should talk about that. Alon's coming out here for another reason in a few days, and not to give a talk, but well, actually no. Alon will be on a panel with me and Ankar and Tara on the free speech book, and while he's here, we'll be talking. We're also I don't know if I could say about it, 'cause I'm not sure when we'll finish it or come out, but there's some other content related to Israel that I might have a hand in. But it won't be a public event at this time on campus. But yeah, I'm certainly open to doing one again.
Yeah, we should talk about. I've got some ideas on kind of what next. Mark, thoughts on a swing state voter deciding between voting for Kamala versus Trump's overt authoritarianism or abstaining from growing tribalism on both sides?
And that's the question, who to vote for. I think if you're a swing state voter, I
think there are a bunch of them.
It's more important than if you're not.
Yep.
But I think in general, you should vote for who you think would be less bad, or who you think would be better and better for the country if you think there is a difference. And sometimes there isn't. And there's a limit to the lesser of two evils, and you might have to squint to see it. And at some point, it's not worth the squinting. Like maybe someone will be 1 or 2 parts per million better. In this case, in the case of the last few elections, I think there's a significant difference. Both candidates are bad. I think Harris is considerably less bad, and considerably the country will be better off if she wins than if Trump does. So I am going to vote for her as much as I find her contemptible. Here in Texas, where it's not going to make much difference. If I was in a swing state, I would be more, inclined to. I wouldn't do it with enthusiasm or excitement.
Yep.
But I haven't ever gotten to vote for someone I was enthusiastic or excited about. And I think that we could talk about why, but I think she's bad in conventional, ordinary ways. The nature of the country, the nature of living in a representative government with a the kind of electoral system we have, which is going to concentrate around two parties, is that you're going to go back and forth between the two parties. Sometimes one party will be in charge, sometimes another will be in charge. And so you have to have a sense of what's par for the course for these two parties. It's not going to be the case, and it wouldn't be good if it were the case, if either of the two parties always won. They would take the country in a direction that's bad, and both of them want to take it in a direction that's bad. Neither of them want to take it in a direction that's good. So you have to think in terms of the status quo for the country is we go back and forth between these parties, and periodically we do. And so you have to have a sense of like what's par for the course for a Democrat and what's good and what's bad about them, and what's par for the course in a Republican for what's good and what's bad about them. And Harris is fairly typical for a Democrat. There were ways in which what she said when she was running in 2020 was worse. She was trying to court the left and it didn't work, and now she's tacked to the center. And that kind of flip-floppiness and not having any convictions is gross and detestable. Unfortunately, that's how most of our politicians are. But basically, she's the Democratic Party with everything that's bad about it, but not a horrific example of a Democrat. I think Trump represents a significant development for the bad in the Republican Party in a way that Harris doesn't for the Democrat. So she's par for the course. Trump represents a new course that he's taken the party on. And even apart from the changes in the party that he's inaugurated and presiding over, which are significantly for the worse, he's somebody who tried to subvert in more ways than one, more than just January 6th, actively tried to subvert the American form of government. The essence of Trump, I think, is to be anti-objectivity in mind, in epistemology, in the way he talks about things, in the way he communicates, in the way he tries to relate to his base, but also anti-objectivity and crusadingly so in what he wants the function of government to be. And that's even apart from the policy direction changes he's initiated in the party, which I think are all for the bad. So I think he represents a kind of unique and horrible force in American politics that's a force for the bad, apart from what's bad about the Republicans, and they have their worst points and their better points. Whereas Harris is squarely within the frame of what you would expect from a Democrat. I think now after Trump, all Republicans will be worse. So what we're going to have to take as normal or par for the course for a Republican is going to be worse in the next election than it was in past elections. And you're not going to be able to say, well, he's for tariffs, so that rules him out. Like they're all going to be for tariffs, as well as all the Democrats are going to be. But Trump, I think, is not just a force for the new badness that he's made part of the Republican Party that's going to be stuck there for a generation, but also a further force against objectivity in the culture and in the political system. And I think that's something that needs to be fought. And it's not that I think his losing will make the Republican Party better, although it may. But I don't think in terms of one of the parties is good and we have to make it better. Both parties are bad, and they've been bad for a very long time and are going to be bad for a long time. What you have to think about is not just, is this person changing the trajectory, moving the party he's in, and therefore moving the political system a little bit to the good or a little bit to the bad, or a lot to the good or a lot to the bad, or are they just more of the same? And I think Harris is more of the same Democrat, which is bad, and Trump is much worse than the same on the Republican side.
Yep. All right. Nathan, there are intellectuals who work in the realm of ideas, but they want to suppress free speech. Why don't they realize that's against their interests?
Well, I don't know how much of an answer this is, but it often helps to notice that something you're trying to explain is an instance of something more general. So what business people are there that are for free trade? Really for free trade, not they want some restrictions lifted off their industry, but they want there to be no regulations. They want capitalism, hardly any. So most people who are working in business are, in favor of particular changes that maybe help their business a little more than others, but they're not for freeing up the economy. Certainly not on principle across all things. Yet freeing up the economy would be better for everybody, not only all business people, but all people. We're all traders. In the exchange of ideas, it's the same as in the exchange of goods. People don't understand and value freedom. And it's a general problem. I don't think it's specific to ideas or intellectuals. part of insofar as there is something special with freedom of ideas, it's related to the idea that we need to separate the realm of thought, the realm of ideas. We can and need to separate it from the economic realm. It's somehow higher, noble, more spiritual. This is the mind-body dichotomy. And insofar as you do have that separation and you think of yourself as valuing freedom for your thought, what you're going to think of as freedom for thought is actually going to entrench types of unfreedom.
Mhm. Justin, we already answered that. Justin, another one from Justin. What do you think about Elon's enthusiastic embrace of MAGA?
I think it's sad.
Yep.
But I mean, one way I think about MAGA is, how I say this? So if you think about the kind of people who were excited by Al Sharpton, I don't know if people know or remember who Al Sharpton was. He now seems more like a genial, mild-mannered guy when he appears on the news. But he came to prominence, I guess, in the 80s as a kind of rabble-rousing politician huckster in New York City, pandering to the African American community, and he was, representing people in kind of hoaxish trials, and he was a real kind of clown figure. But he appealed to people who felt mistreated, who felt the victims of racism, and they were often the victims of racism, who felt disenfranchised, who felt the system wasn't speaking to them, and so forth, and they were looking for champions. And he had a shtick that appealed to some of these people. They were angry, they were pissed off, they didn't know what to be pissed off at. They didn't have a place to direct their rage. And there's a kind of person that knows how to appeal to that kind of person, that knows how to appeal to someone who's pissed off. And again, maybe they have good reasons for being pissed off, but they don't understand it or know how to do something constructive with it. And I think that Donald Trump is very much that kind of phenomenon as a political leader, but appealing to a different constituency, and a constituency that feels maligned, mistreated, disrespected, and often for very good reason. But they're misconceptualizing what it is. So I think just as there are these kind of race grievance hustlers, there are grievance hustlers around other issues. And there are a number of issues around which I think the kind of appeal Trump has to people has to do with that. He's a champion. He's someone who will fight for us. We are disrespected. And business people, certainly, if anybody is disrespected in the country and need someone to fight for them, it's them. And some of them have come to think of this version of the Republican Party as for them. I think it's no more true than that what Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson was doing was what was really going to serve Black people and help protect their rights. Indeed, I think these kind of movements hurt the very people that they're appealing to or pandering to. But it's a general phenomenon that there are movements like this, and that people, often good people, are susceptible to them. And one has to work not to be susceptible to them, in fact.
What are your thoughts on UPenn, what UPenn is doing to Amy Wax?
I think Amy Wax is awful. If I ran a law school, I wouldn't hire her. I don't believe in the kind of academic freedom that people think would be violated by getting rid of her.
Mm-hmm.
And I've met her. I was at a conference with her. I thought she was really an odious person. And I was really put off by how some of the better people at the conference I thought were too nice to her. It may be that what Penn is doing is in violation of their contract with her, in which case, she should have a legal case against them and they shouldn't do it. But then, should they have had that kind of contract in the first place? And it also is the case that schools like UPenn are incredibly hypocritical. So somebody's saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and Intifada revolution, and all this stuff, and that's fine, that's free speech. But Amy Wax says that, we shouldn't have Asians in the country and whatever, and now she's a pariah. Like, you can't, there's obviously a double standard there. If Amy Wax should be shunned, a lot of other things should be shunned that aren't shunned. And Penn can't have it both ways, and Penn's hypocritical and it's ridiculous. But I've never under any illusions that any of these schools have reasonable or decent standards for speech. And if one's going to stand up for her, I think one, it should not be for her, like she's some unique victim. It's for what one thinks should be a good speech policy in a university. And I'm not invested enough in any of these particular schools to have a view of what their particular policy should be. So yeah, she's being treated she's being disowned by a university for things that are no worse than other people have done that they're not disowning for them, but which are really bad. And I think, and the university is pretty bad. I'm not one of these people who thinks you shouldn't go to a university and you shouldn't deal with them. And I work at a university and so forth. But you have to understand it as these are deeply corrupt institutions that one has to figure out, if one wants to deal with them, why and what one can get out of them, and why and how to kind of navigate your way through something that's got a lot of corruption in it. And it's not like it's okay except for what they do to right wingers or what they, it's the whole thing is topsy-turvy and bad in lots of ways. And I don't think there's a unique badness that's happening to her. As far as how bad is what she's doing, well, one, her views, I think, are just odious and shouldn't be respected, but no worse than a lot of other views that are like that. But two, I think the way she talks about her students is something that's just unprofessional and inappropriate if you're a professor. To say, for example, I've never had a student from this race who's been in this section of my class or so forth. Well, now somebody comes out of that school and, she was an English, and you're in effect revealing unflattering information about them. You have a kind of professional obligation to whatever your general views are about a race or a segment of society, not disparage your students in public. And I think some of the things she said on Lowry's show, which I listened to and elsewhere, are effectively disparaging her students in public. I think it's unprofessional. And even apart from the content of reviews, which I think are a part of a very false and very ugly intellectual tradition.
It's interesting that so many people treat her well and treat her as some kind of positive force on the right. I'm not even sure exactly.
Well, the best semi-defense of her that wasn't like, this woman's awful, but what Penn's doing is wrong, we need to have thick skins about it, was McWhorter wrote in the Times. I thought, if you're going to have the view that the institution should allow this, McWhorter's view is the right version of it. I haven't found that many people who are openly saying she's, we need more like Amy Wax, she's a champion, but it gets too close to that. And in particular, when I was at this academic freedom conference at Stanford, I think the conference is up online and one could find it. I thought how pally people were on panels with her about, well, we're all victims of this thing and you should call Amy and get advice up if it ever happens to you. I thought was gross. People who I had thought were a lot better than her and still think are a lot better than her in some ways were way too close to her.
Seems pretty common in academia where there's very little judging.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I like the numbers. Says, I read someone say the objectivist movement's history has shown tribal characteristics. Why is that an unfair charge?
Almost certainly every movement's history has shown some tribal characteristics. So at that level, it's not an unfair charge. But if it's like there's something particularly tribal about this movement that would separate it out from every other human institution, I think that's unfair. But we'd have to go into the details of it, I think.
Yeah, we'd have to get some examples. Justin, have you changed your view on Richard Hanania since the last time you talked?
I forget when the last time we talked is. He's a complicated character. So He's often very, very, I think I've said some positive things about him on this show. I
Yep.
don't remember if I've also said some negative things. I can't remember when the last time.
I think we spoke after the revelation about, his racist past came out, and we were still a little hesitant because we hadn't heard his completely maybe what he was going to do about it.
Yeah, so he came out with a statement, something like "Why I used to suck and hopefully no longer do."
Yeah.
I thought it was way too flip.
Yep.
And he wasn't taking seriously, and in general doesn't take seriously enough, that ideas have a moral valence and you have responsibility for the ideas you advocate. And that it's not just, oh, I was wrong about something, but I was supporting something vile and vicious, and people have reason to be suspect about me because of that. If you
Mhm.
read how Leonard Peikoff in his essay Fact and Value talks about how somebody who was a member of something awful would feel about it after the fact, and what they would expect and so forth, how they would expect people to treat them and how they would talk about their mistakes. I don't think I think Leonard's right about that, and I don't think Hanania at all lives up to that, and I think that's really to his discredit. On a number of issues, though, I think he's very good. I
Yep.
think it's better for the world that he's writing than that he should disappear. In particular, among voices on the right who make some of the mistakes he made, um, I think he's a good kind of counterbalance about showing what's wrong with some of them, although without enough moral tone to him.
Mhm.
I also think there's an argument about things like wokeness, if you want to call it that, to what extent they're caused by these deep ideological causes. People, it's Foucault or Derrida or the whatever, and to what extent they're caused by um, structural features of the legal system and institutions. And I
Mhm.
think at a very macroscopic level, at the level of hundreds of years, these kind of things are mostly caused by, philosophy being the cause of history. But at the level of 20 or 30 years, I think a lot more, and the details of how it pans out, I think there's a lot more to the kind of institutional history causing it. And I think that Hanania, who's very much, maybe too much on that side of the causal theory,
Mhm.
is right and insightful about a lot of the causal pathways, particularly around civil rights law and the kind of things that are called wokeness, and why it's kind of, a younger generation of people at magazines who are pushing this and in what departments they are. If you want to follow the causal history of that, I think his book on the origins of woke it has a lot right about it.
Mhm. Yeah, I just noticed. I mean, I can't make him out. I can't make it out complete. He writes some excellent stuff. He's doing some really good stuff on Israel, even though just a couple of years ago I was convinced, or just after he wrote that essay, I was convinced he was still quite anti-Semitic, and now he's gone kind of the other way, where he seems to overly love anything to do with Israel, and it's really hard to tell. And then I just recently saw he did an interview with Amy Wax,
Yeah.
and I doubt that it was confrontational. It seemed to be quite friendly. So it's really hard to tell
And he's interviewed her
what's
several
real.
times.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he's still, in a certain sense, a racist. I think he still thinks a lot more is biologically determined
Mhm.
than he is, and that it matters more than it does. But he doesn't think that kind of government policies and so forth should be racist. He's become aware that there's something wrong and ugly with the centrality. Like, if you thought that some races were just genetically stupider, and on average and so forth. And of course, there are exceptions, but like, you have this kind of view. The right way to think of it is like, here's a sad and unfortunate truth, and it's not something to trumpet or get excited about. And yes, people are suppressed, don't want to talk about it, but in part because it's ugly and gross, and maybe that's wrong, but that's not the main thing that's wrong with the world, and so forth. And we should be careful about how we say it and when we say it. And I think that's in effect the kind of place that he's come to. And if you're going to have that view of people and of races, that's the more rational way to hold it. And it's not necessarily bigoted,
Yeah.
but it is wrong and mistaken. And I think belies a deep misunderstanding of human nature and of what's important about people. And hopefully he's in the process of generally getting better. But I don't think he's recognized the full extent and nature of the ugliness of that belief and that it's trickled down through his way of thinking. And I don't know that he's going to.
All right, Lucinda asks, can you recommend any philosophical fiction that tries to honestly deal with its themes, whether right in its ideas or not, excluding Rand's works?
I don't really read or haven't read much that I would classify as philosophical fiction, other than Rand and I mean some Sartre maybe.
So Camus and Sartre, yeah, the
Yeah,
existentialist.
but I'm not that interested in that. I like if I'm interested in fiction, I want it to be good fiction. If I want it to be philosophy, I'm interested in what I have reason to think is good philosophy, and I haven't had much reason to think those things overlap in very many people. So I don't gravitate towards things that I think of as philosophical fiction. And so I don't have recommendations in it. I think a lot of, if you look for things that are great fiction, it's often philosophical, even if it's not meant to be, and even if it's not original philosophy. So there's interesting philosophical things in Hugo and Dostoevsky and romantic writers generally. And I would just like try to find things that you have reason to think are great fiction.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Nicholas says, thank you for having Dr. Salmieri on. His work, including his most recent essay, have been very influential. Thank you, Nicholas. Lucinda, I want to thank Greg for all the great insight he's been providing in the recent ARI bookshelf discussions. These videos are some of my favorite ARI content, in no small part thanks to Greg.
Well, thanks. I think we're going to be doing more of them. I'm not on all of them, but it was I was part of. Well, I pushed hard for that becoming a series. I thought there was a real need for something like that, and in particular, I thought, and the ones we've had so far haven't yet borne this out, that it would be a good way to have some of the more junior people involved in the Institute's orbit get some content out from them, and to make a product out of and expose people to some of the kind of thinking that a lot of us do, behind closed doors in small conversations as we're processing the books of the day. And there's another one of these, there's an episode on this with some younger people that we're, thinking about putting together. I'm not sure whether we'll do it or not, but I'm sure there will be on a particular book, and I'm sure there will be other ones, in the future. Some I expect with me on them.
Good. Shazbot, how soon after becoming commercially available would you consider eating a lab-grown cheeseburger?
I don't know, that day, I guess. It would depend on.
I'm curious.
I mean, there are ones that are commercially available, and I haven't eaten them yet. Like there's the Impossible Burger from Burger King.
Is that lab-grown, or is it just made from vegetables?
I don't know. I guess it's made from vegetable. I'm not sure, but I would. I mean, I haven't eaten one of those yet, so I guess. But it wouldn't be. It would be a matter of either I would be interested in it for the gee whiz factor, or it would be because I thought it would taste good. I was told that it would taste good, so I'd read the reviews. How does this taste? I wouldn't be worried about it.
Yep.
That it might be unsafe. I don't think it would come out if it weren't safe.
Yep. Slug 1776. Communism has claimed the lives of millions wherever it's been tried, except Vietnam. Can you explain that?
Well, it killed plenty of people during the Vietnam War and during Vietnam. That it's a smaller population. I don't know the details of exactly what. I mean, I wouldn't list them as a success story. Maybe the death toll there is a little less than some other places, unless you know something I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious about the specific history of Vietnam. I don't know it, but why, let's say, fewer people died. But it was still a pretty brutal regime and pretty nasty to live there. And the Civil War, of course, or the war between the South and the North killed many, many people.
I mean, it's sort of Vietnam fell to communism around the time that communism was sort of losing its luster, right? So it might have just been, at a time when it, like most communist countries aren't communist anymore. They're like China. I mean, China's bad and it's getting worse, but it's not specifically communist bad. It's general totalitarian. And
You did have Pol Pot after
yeah,
Vietnam.
yeah, that's true. And around the same time, but at the end of it, and maybe the just the horror of that, was a precautionary tale.
Yeah.
Um, but it was like, Mao, what he did happened earlier, right? And we're at the kind of end of the period of aggressive, consistent
Hmm.
communists who are ready to murder millions for their idea. They're kind of less ideological by that time. It's kind of starting to fail. And maybe if things were less bad per capita in Vietnam, that would be why, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Yeah, pickaxing in Europa. I don't mind free speech providing it doesn't advocate for physical harm. CJS Mill, harm principle. I see this on ex-academic personnel accounts, views on my own. Well, whose else would they be? So I guess,
Um,
what do you think of the of Mill's harm principle?
it's wrong, or it's too vague anyway to be useful.
So what do you mean by that? Tell us
The principle is you're free to do anything that doesn't harm anybody. But what does harm mean if if I say unjustly say things about you, Iran's awful or so forth, is that harming you? If I refuse to hire you, is that because I don't like your views and so forth? Is that harming you? Seemingly it is.
Mhm.
But it's not violating your rights. It's um, and then you should harm people who are bad in ways that don't violate their rights. So it's I think the wrong concept for moral purposes, putting things in terms of harm.
I mean, Mill's struggling because he doesn't have rights, right? He doesn't have the concept.
But it's not like, oh, this poor sap, he doesn't have it. He rejects it, and he's part of a
Yep.
movement for
Yep.
rejecting it.
Rejecting it. All right. So Neo says, when discussing morality or philosophy, what's one thing Yaron could improve on when he is debating or giving a lecture?
I mean, if I had things, I talked to Iran, I'd tell him if I thought there was something he should improve
Yep.
on. And debating, I mean, debating is a different skill. You have to do things fast, and I wouldn't have anything in particular to say about that.
Um, Justin, are universities still important for cultural change in an age of internet and social media? There's so many alternative options to spreading ideas.
Yeah, I think they are, but they're not the only path. I think if you think about what cultural change will look like, a part of it will be institutions of higher learning changing. And there will be institutions of higher learning, which ones there are, and exactly what form they take, and what things they specialize in, and how many people go to them. All of those things are always changing and should always be changing. And it oughtn't be quite like it is now 10 years from now. But that there will be institutions where people go to study with experts, and where people congregate, and that have people with expertise on a wide range of topics and so forth. That thing is going to continue to exist. And part of what it is for a culture to get better, part of how it will get better, is that the ideas prevalent and common in those institutions will get better. If that doesn't happen, then the culture isn't getting better. And if it does, that's part of the culture getting better. But whether that's the leading or lagging indicator, where exactly that is in the battle and so forth, um, that's, you know, um, very much up for debate. And I
Mhm.
don't think it's that cultures change, all of the private sector starts thinking something, and then only then does a government official start thinking it. And then 5 years later, somebody gets on the university faculty that starts thinking it. Changes happen at once on many different fronts, with some having more causal impetus on others. And universities are one of the things in the mix. I think that has to be in the mix,
Mhm.
but exactly where the causal lymph is and how much emphasis one should put on one versus another depends on one's specific goals as an organization, as an individual, etc.
Yep. Kirill, what is the difference between a cause and a reason, as in the sentence, I don't have a reason?
Um, so I worry about, um, words mean things in context, and there are different meanings of cause and reason in different as different people use them in popular parlance is used differently. So I a little bit worry about questions that want to legislate on what does this word mean in this sentence, and the sentence is plucked out of nowhere, and I can figure out what kind of usage you might be alluding to, but anything I say, you know, I'm sure there's some context where it wouldn't quite be apt for. But usually, a reason is a consideration that somebody thinks about when they're deciding what to do. It's their basis for deciding something. So what is your reason for having a podcast? Versus what caused you to have a podcast. There you're treating you like a kind of physical system without free will, without thinking about it, and what, you know, what thing in the past made it the case that you did this. So you might have a, you know, a cause for why you got sick. This antigen, you know, infected you, or you had this genetic disposition. You don't have a reason for getting sick, but there was a, you know, a cause that caused you to get sick. And now you're being sick and you're loving your life and so forth, gives you a reason to take medicine and seek treatment. And you might say there's no reason why a certain person believes a certain religion. They were caused to believe it by the upbringing they had, but they actually don't have any reason to believe it, and that's why they ought to change their mind about it. And likewise for a lot of other beliefs. So there's that kind of distinction you can make, but the words cause and reason are used in different ways in different contexts, and sometimes one's used to mean the other and so forth. So, you know, that's not a legislation on how these words are or should be used every time they're used.
All right. Mary Ben says, how does a biotech founder teach good epistemology to her scientists? Can she pay ARI to create a course, or a UT professor?
This is the girl who's always flirting. The woman who's always flirting with someone on your show, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay.
She's a founder of a biotech company. So in spite of the flirting, she's a serious person.
Well, I don't, the flirting needn't make you unserious. I think
Well, flirting on my show might make you unserious.
Yeah, maybe. I think in general, epistemology is usually best taught in a context around an issue. So there you can teach an epistemology course, but I think if I were an employer trying to teach epistemology to my employees, I would think about how to embody it in material related to the particular tasks in the job. Here's how we do this. Here's how we file these reports. Here's how we research this. Here's how things get, you know, whatever. I don't know what you guys do, but here's how we talk about this issue in science, and here's why. And so I would think about it a lot about embedding the right epistemology in the particular practices of the business, and think about in your own thinking, how does it influence how you think about, well, what? I don't know. I've never started a biotech company. I don't work in biotech, and I don't know enough about it. But think about the particular things that you want to happen differently at your company than has happened at other companies you worked or that you know about because of your way of thinking about knowledge. And then think about how to embed that in processes and how to make the rationale for it clear. I would think that would be broadly the way to do it. And I think the way you might want to involve philosophers in it, whether ARI or UT professors, would be in more in a role of consulting on helping you answer those questions, and then think about the processes, and then think about training materials that would help those processes then, and like they would write a course for you. But maybe, I don't know, it would be an interesting thing to talk about.
Yeah, sounds like a great challenge.
I know ARI has done courses for business people. You at Hutchinson at one point, and I think you tilted at UT. So there's some precedent for that.
Yeah, we've done stuff, not necessarily a course in epistemology, but the way you've described it, Greg, I think would be. I'm sure we have the people who would be interested in doing something like that.
And for what it's worth, I'm interested in developing and have been doing some work on developing some materials related to critical thinking and epistemology. And so, you know, if there's a particular application to do with a business, I'd be interested in hearing about it.
Yeah, Mary Benz, contact us if it's a serious consideration. Shazbat says, would there be fewer bullies in schools if they were all private?
I think so. For the following reason, public schools force everybody together. And if there's some kid who's awful and everyone hates and he picks on them and fights them, well, we can't throw him out. Or we can ship. So they create a problem of people having to be with people they don't want to be with. And private schools don't have that problem. There'll be different ones with different admissions criteria, and kids will leave if they're getting beaten up in the school and so forth. And the school won't be forced to keep the kids who are beating the other kids up. And so what public schools does is make anyone's problem everyone's problem. And the fact that there's a kid who can't keep his hands off others should just be his problem and his parents' problem, but it becomes the whole community's problem uh, if no one's allowed to disassociate from him.
Yep. Justin, are there non-egalitarian and rational reasons to prefer watching women's sports over men's? Male athletes are better at the sports that we have.
Oh, so you're saying the reasons you know of that are non-egalitarian would lead you to prefer men's sports. Are there reasons to prefer watching women's sports that aren't egalitarian? So first of all, I'm not a sports lover. I don't watch much sports, and so I'm not the best person to ask this question for. I can imagine reasons somebody might enjoy watching women's sports. You might, particularly for certain sports, just like the aesthetics of it. A friend of mine was telling me that he thinks the way even apart from being attracted to the athletes or something, the way the motions are in women's sports of certain sorts are different from men's sports, and the skill set is different, and he's just come to enjoy watching them. So some people seem to and claim to have such reasons. I do think a lot of the interest in women's sports and the growth of women's sports as a kind of industry has been due to egalitarianism and a lot of the issues that have come up around trans women in women's sports and whether it's fair and so forth. A lot of there's something kind of ironic about it because the sports themselves have come to prominence on this false premise of everybody has a right to have something they could compete in, and then now you have this other person who thinks they have a right to compete in it, and it's a kind of live by the sword, die by the sword kind of situation. But yeah, but if you're thinking, there are certainly reasons women have for wanting to play in some sports, and some people have reasons for wanting to watch them. And under a system of freedom and a system where people are unabashedly pursuing their self-interest in sports and entertainment, I expect there'd be some women's sports and some people would want to watch them. I suspect somewhat less than we have now.
Yep. All right, we got five questions left.
Right.
It says, if concepts are caused and we can treat them like abstract entities, how do they act?
Well, there's a little bit of flattening what these terms mean here. We cause them. They are entities in a way, but they're more like products or institutions. And so I think the way to think about the best analogy for thinking about concepts is like a limb or an organ. It's something that's but caused or made volitionally. So it's something that's caused by a life form that's part of its life. It's part of your mind, the concept. And so it's part of you in the way your hand is a part of you, but it's a mental part of you, not a physical part of you. And then how does it act? Well, it doesn't act all on its own. It acts as part of you using it, just like your hand doesn't act all on its own. But how does your hand act? Well, it can grasp, it can move back and forth, it can wave, it can go up. It acts in the ways hands act, but we don't usually say the hand acts. We say the person acts by means of the hand, and likewise with the concept. But you'd still say your hand is an entity in a sense, or it's a part of you, so it's not its own entity, but it's,
Justin, many Me Too progressive activists want to stamp out sexual behaviors in society, but advocate for more lenient jail sentences for sex crimes. How do they square this contradiction?
Well, it's not just sex crimes. I mean, so I don't know that it's specific to Me Too. It's a kind of general kind of leftist position. I don't know but it's not just sex. I mean, so the leftist causes, the Democratic Party and people on the left are forever wanting more gun laws, right? And also wanting not to enforce very strongly the gun laws that there are. When they, arrest someone with a gun, they want them to let off. So it's a general feature of leftism as it exists in the world now, that you want more laws against certain kinds of things, but also when the enforcement of those laws tends to end up imprisoning people who you think are from minority, underrepresented, repressed, however you view it. I'm trying to, through their mindset population, you then tend to favor leniency. And sex crimes are just no different from other crimes in that respect.
Andrew, Reardon nicknamed a character non-absolute in an affectionate but derogatory way. How can one acknowledge that significant nuance exists in complex issues while still making absolute determinations?
How can you, in other words, so the Reardon is just being like non-absolute is bad, but how can you acknowledge nuance without that? Well, the way I think about it, Ayn Rand's article, The Cult of Moral Grayness, is really influential on my thinking here, so I'd recommend reading that. This is really just a metaphor, but you think about, like, you can have black and white, but in tiny, tiny dots, right? Like, so the thing is gray, and there are lots of gradations and fine-tuned degrees of gray, but it's resolvable into black and white if you look close enough and think hard enough about it. And for some things, you have to look really close and think really hard to understand the phenomenon there. But that doesn't mean there's no absolutes, there's no black and white. It just means particular things are often complicated. And then what you have to think about is, are you using the claim that something is complicated as an excuse? I don't have to form a judgment about this. It doesn't, it matters to me in my life and so forth, but I'm just going to say it's complicated, so I'm not going to take a stand where I need to. I'm hiding behind the complexity. Or are you saying, no, where I need to take stands, where I need to know what's true and false, I do the work to find it. I recognize it sometimes takes work. I recognize that sometimes it's hard, but it's not always hard. And this is just part of the responsibility of being a thinker in the world. So you have to recognize that, there's often complexity, but it's possible. Complexity is resolvable into simple components. It takes work to do it. You don't always need to do the work because you don't need to have a judgment on every issue. But it's also possible to use that set of facts as an excuse for not facing something you need to. And so you just need to be sensitive to that. That's an error people can make. And when are you making it?
Lucinda, I don't know how late it is in Germany right now. Can you recommend any books on sexual ethics?
No. I can't think of any book I've read on that I've liked. There are books on it that I think are interesting for various reasons, but that they're not recommendations. I think what they say is mostly true.
Hyperreason. How can I effectively balance my intellectual and practical sides to become an integrated individual like Ayn Rand's heroes?
How can I practically balance my intellectual? What was the other side?
Intellectual and practical side. So effectively balance intellectual and practical side.
Something about the question feels to me like there's a wrong premise here. And in general, I think that about balancing questions, like people ask about work-life balance and so forth, as though your work is something way apart from your life, and well, you should have 68% work and 40%. Your intellectual and practical sides, practical things, require intelligence and thought, and being an intellectual involves all kinds of practical problems. How am I going to get a job doing this? And how am I going to get my ideas out to people? And how important is, there are all kinds of things someone could mean by this that I think, might be true. And there are all kinds of questions that someone could conceptualize under that heading that might be valid questions with right answers to them. But that doesn't feel to me like a helpful or constructive heading to think about them under. So I would think about that. I would think more concretely about what problem am I having, and then how should I conceptualize it, and then how to solve it. And on the work-life balance stuff, not that this is what you're talking about, but as a model for thinking about these balancing issues, Gina Gorlin on her Substack Building the Builders, has written some about this, I think. So look up what she said, and it might be a helpful example for how to think about questions about balance.
All right, I think this is the last question. Is taxation a mild form of slavery?
I don't like putting it that way, because the whole point of the word slavery is that it's not, you can say, like, is having the flu a mild form of death? Well, no, because death means the non-mild thing. So it's a comparatively mild form of force, of expropriation, of servitude, but we have the name slavery to mean the whole enchilada, the whole thing. So yeah, there's a point you could make by putting it that way, but I don't think it's that clarifying. And I wouldn't people can get oversensitive about comparisons to slavery in ways that I think are wrong. And there are contexts of certain arguments where I think making that comparison is really useful. But I don't think in most contexts it's the way to put it.
All right. Thank you, Greg.
Well, this has been fun.
Yeah, good. Good. Thanks, guys. Great questions. Neil, thank you for the sticker. Let's see. Eric, a sticker. And Carolina again. All right. And I think we caught all the rest. So thanks, Greg.
Okay.
Really appreciate these. And we'll have to do it again sometime soon.
This is fun. I'm looking forward to it.